So we're going to look at adding extra touches of realism to your composites. And these are all kind of additional to the fundamental motion tracking side of what we're doing. And I'm going to discuss a few different things. One is going to be motion blur. One is going to be adjustment layers. And the other thing then is just a very specific look at how we can use things like effects and presets to try and make our graphics that we've composited into our scene look a little bit more like they may have belonged in the real world as part of the original plate. So just to kick off, we'll talk about motion blur. Now, motion blur is something that happens in the camera when you set your shutter speed to be at a particular amount. And the slower the shutter speed, the more motion blur that you get, and obviously the faster the shutter speed, the less motion blur you get. Now, when we do tracking, all tracking, but particularly where we're trying to follow points around frame by frame, it's often advisable to use a fast shutter speed so that when we encounter the track, or the dot in this case, the tracking point, frame by frame, it's always going to be reasonably sharp, even if there's a lot of camera movement. I think this was shot at something like 1/300th of a second, and I knew I needed to keep the dots sharp, so I kept it as fast as possible, bumped up the ISO and so on, and that's how you see the dots staying very trackable and very sharp. Now, the flip side is that when you don't have motion blur, you end up with a very kind of jagged looking look. See how it's very kind of rough looking in terms of the temporal kind of jaggedness, not the pixels. So what we need to do is we need to try and kind of leverage our shutter speed to allow us to capture sharp things by making the shutter speed very fast. And then when we're done doing our tracking, then we need to add in fake motion blur at the end so that it looks a little bit smoother and a little bit more natural. Now, the motion blur in After Effects is called pixel motion blur, and it allows you to change the shutter angle, samples, and vector detail. Now, the shutter angle is the really important one here. Basically, if you don't know what a shutter angle is, just go to YouTube. It's kind of another way of looking at shutter speed, and it harkens back to the old film cameras, but you can just use as a rule of thumb, the bigger the shutter angle, the slower the shutter speed. Okay, so big numbers equate to slow shutter and motion blur. Okay, so if I switch this on, and we'll just zoom in on maybe our dot there, and we'll turn on our motion blur. That's not so noticeable in the dot, but maybe if I can find something with a bit more movement in it. There we go. So we can see that it kind of softens, and you can see that there's a nice bit of motion blur there. Now you can up the samples to create even more kind of blurring effect, but beware this, put them way too high there. This significantly slows things down. Okay. Now the shutter angle, if I bump that up, we should see an even more pronounced blurring, and I can switch it off, sharp, on, blurry. You can see it probably more in the background because the camera is kind of orbiting around the sign. The background is moving more than the sign. Okay, and you'll see that all across the clip there, in the trees, the wall, the background, leaves going from sharp to blurry, sharp to blurry. You'll see it also blurring slightly in the dots as well, and that's why we always use our fast shutter speed to capture sharp detail, and then we fake the look of motion blur in post. Now, if you have something moving with our clips, such as text or whatever you happen to have following those target points, then you will also use motion blur here. Okay, so that motion blur needs to be set here, and that allows you to get the realistic kind of looking. You can see it kind of sharpening and softening there. It's subtle but noticeable, and that allows us to get a little bit more realism into the text as well. Now, it's not that noticeable there, but it is certainly a rule of thumb that you want to. Okay, that might be a little bit more pronounced in terms of there we go. So that's a nice bit of motion blur there. Now that's actually because it's animating, but it shows you the effect of the blur. So motion blur. avoid it when you're shooting, and then try and enhance it when you've done your composite. Okay, so the next thing we'll look at now is the use of adjustment layers. Now, adjustment layers are being used to pass effects down across all layers where the effects only need to be applied in one place. Now, what I've done here is I have applied a hue and saturation adjustment to an adjustment layer, and that adjustment layer is going to send that adjustment all the way down through all of the text and whatever else happens to be in our timeline. So if I switch it off, or switch the effect off, you'll see that it's just black text. But when I switch it on, the adjustment layer, combined with a number of masks, feathered masks, allows the effect of the hue and saturation to only show up in various places. So you might ask yourself, well, why would you have something as odd as a blue, soft blue area up here, down here on black text? Well, the reason is that when we go back up into our layer above, you'll notice that there's a slight sheen on the sign. And I also want to kind of enhance and build on that across the image. And when that is applied, it's going to be applied as a multiply effect. So it's not that I want blue and black. I want a color that when I multiply it with the background will give me a nice kind of fake look of a reflection. And you can notice it the most here in the O. It looks very realistic, as if it's a piece of metal with a bit of light shining onto it. Now remember, if this were set to normal, then we would just have that nasty looking blue, but because it is set to multiply, that multiplies by the value of the yellow and gives us that kind of sheen with a slight green to it, but I would maintain somewhat realistic looking given the nature of the overall clip. So that is adjustment layers, and they should be used all the time if you want to try and just fake the look of some sort of a reflection or some light being bounced off something, with the intention that we want to make the text look as if it belongs on that piece of metal, and we need to take as much of the metallic nature of that metal and build it into our text as well. That is, of course, being overlaid on top. So that's the adjustment layer being used to try and create a little bit of a reflection. Now the next thing, again, is very specific, but I wanted to create a roughen edges effect on my text. So if I zoom in again there and just kill that mask, you'll see that the text kind of breaks up in various places and looks like it's been worn away slightly, as it would on the original plate. Well, maybe not so much, but anyway, I want it to look rough so that it looks like it's been printed on and worn off over time. So a nice one for that is called Roughen Edges. And if I switch it off, you'll see the text in its original, very kind of clean looking, not so real looking, and then add a little bit of grit and grain to it through the roughen effect. Now, the roughen effect and effects like it are often better used in conjunction with a mask. So if I just open my close that and just open the effects themselves, we've got roughen edges and edge type and all that you can play around with. But the important thing here is that the compositing options at the very bottom of the effect have a mask applied to them, and that mask is visible here. So it kind of loops in and out, and it's got a feathered edge on it so that it kind of only applies it in various places, which gives it a little bit more realism, because it would look very uniform otherwise, and it would look very much like an effect. So a little bit like the adjustment layer, it's quite often used with masks to try and create kind of a variation of the effect across the entire image. So something to think about if you're putting kind of signage up or anything that's been kind of printed or worn over time. Even a touch will very often give you a little bit of extra realism. So those are three ways that I would advise. The first one being motion blur is essential. The adjustment layers are heavily advised, in that it allows you to create more natural looking surfaces. And the third one is just a specific solution to a specific problem, but I would suggest that that problem is going to be quite common if you're putting very artificial looking text into a real scene. Now, there are a lot of other stuff going on here. There's transparencies, there's color grades, there's all kinds of stuff. Anything at all that you need to do to blend or mix or marry the target object, the text, into the background layer should be used. There's no one set approach for this. There's only all of the things that you can think of to leverage in your, while you're trying to make things look as natural as possible.